8. Explanations and mutations. Billy was shaking with indecision as he saw the big man leaving the graveyard carrying 2 bodies. One of them was one of the 3 boys from the posh school. He couldn't care less about that little creep. But the other was Miss Smith, and she had been fair and decent. For a second, as he hid behind the tree, Billy fingered his fish-gutting knife and considered the possibility of jumping out and plunging the blade into the big man's back. He knew, though, that it wouldn't be easy to make it a killing stroke in this light and with such a huge target, and that the man could move fast enough that he'd not have the chance for a second stroke. Then the rat-faced man appeared beside his companion, and Billy dropped his plan of immediate attack. Instead, he decided the best thing to do was to follow the men and see what they did with Miss Smith. He already knew that the doctor was staying over at the Pig and Thistle. Once he was certain of the men's destination, he could call in help. One thing he was certain of, even though he couldn't explain the conviction, was that the doctor was the best possible person to have on his side in the looming battle. Alice was almost shaking after her encounter with Ross. It was mostly anger, not fear. She couldn't believe the arrogance of the man. How could he demand so much and offer so little, and then appear to be annoyed with her simply because she refused to trust him? Hadn't he proven over and over again that any such trust would be sorely misplaced? She couldn't understand how Roger could possibly be friends with the man or fall for his claims. True, Ross was superficially charming, but what lay in his depths? But she knew that Roger was no fool, so what had possessed him to trust Ross? She simply couldn't work it out. All she could do was to ride home and wait until near midnight and then deliver the message she'd promised to her father. He would know what to do. He always did. Doyle had been unable to get any rest at all. He'd returned to the Hope to discover that Gray was firm about sailing the following afternoon. Uncertain whether or not he'd be finished with the mystery, Doyle had packed his few personal items and moved over to the tavern for the night. There he had attempted to get some sleep, since it was likely to be a long evening. But rest had eluded him, excitement burned inside, and his mind was in a whirl. He was still unable to make out too much of the mystery. The best he could say was that at least the various puzzles seemed linked by the factory. But how they could be linked was still way beyond his imagination. Maybe he'd be better off giving up the idea of becoming a writer. If he couldn't even make out the threads of reality, how could he ever hope to invent any? Finally, at a little after 10, he gave up all attempts at resting and elected to take a stroll outside to clear his head. It was a bright but cold night, with the ever-present wind whipping up leaves and trash in the streets. The town was quietening down, with the patrons of the Pig and Thistle having left for home earlier. The fishermen were at sea and their families abed. He seemed to be the only one on the quiet streets. Then he heard the pattering sound of bare feet on the cobbles, and around the corner flew a scarecrow of a boy. Doyle recognised him instantly. "Billy!" he exclaimed. "Whatever is the matter?" The youngster skidded to a halt, looking at him warily before his identity penetrated. "Oh, it's you," he said, relieved. "Quick, we got to warn the doctor." "Warn him about what?" asked Doyle, alarmed. "His friend. She were in the graveyard. 2 men have took her to the factory." "Good Lord!" Doyle was shocked. "She was supposed to be recuperating at Fulbright Hall. What the dickens was she thinking of? Still, no time to worry about that now." He thought fast. "Billy, are there any of your irregular friends you can rouse?" "I?" the boy agreed, puzzled. "If there's one who can ride a horse, the doctor has one stabled here at the tavern. Send a message to Alexander Cromwell and tell him what's happened. He'll have to organise the forces of the law." "Aye, but what about a doctor?" "I'll rouse him myself." Doyle gave him an encouraging smile. "We were going to go to the factory tonight anyway. The game has just become a trifle more urgent, that's all. On your way, Billy. Right-o, sir. Billy saluted in a ragged fashion, and then ran off. Excitement glowed within Doyle as he ran back inside the tavern and up the stairs to the doctor's room. He hammered on the door and called his friend's name. A moment later, the doctor threw open the door. "Whatever is the matter?" he growled. Doyle was pleased to see the man was fully dressed and pulling on his deerstalker. "It's Miss Smith," he gasped. "She's been taken by 2 ruffians to the factory. She was in the graveyard, apparently. And you told her to stay at the hall." "Sarah never does what she's told," complained the doctor. "She's almost as bad as me in that respect. Right, let's go." He hurried past Doyle and down the stairs. The medical man whirled around and followed him. "What was she thinking of?" complained Doyle as they came out into the street. He fingered the revolver he carried in his pocket, a trusty Adams .450 that constantly threatened to fall to the ground as he hurried to keep up with the doctor. "She realised that there was a good chance of the grave robbers striking again," the doctor snapped. "She must have been waiting for them and been captured." "Oh," Doyle considered this a moment. "Didn't you think there was a chance of them striking?" "Of course I did," the doctor growled. "That's why I left them to it. I figured that if they stole the body, we'd discover it at the factory when we arrived. That way there would be clear and conspicuous grounds for the arrests of all concerned. As usual, Sarah's jumped the gun and landed us all in serious trouble." It was beginning to dawn on Doyle how little he'd anticipated the doctor's complex planning. "It was a smart idea," he approved. "And now wasted," the doctor complained. He gestured ahead. "There's the factory now." "Right." Doyle drew his revolver. "Do we storm the walls, break down the gate, or what?" "I'll go for the what," the doctor replied softly. "We aren't the first people to arrive here tonight. Unless I'm very much mistaken, there goes a man I'm eager to have more than a few words with. Quickly, follow me, but don't shoot or make any untoward noise." He sprang forward like a leopard after a gazelle. Doyle struggled to keep up with him as he dashed through the few remaining dark streets after the shadowy figures ahead of them. He and the doctor were almost upon the 2 men when the leader whirled about with an exclamation. He lowered a walking stick as he saw who it was. "Doctor!" exclaimed Colonel Ross, startled. "I was not expecting you quite yet." "I didn't think you were," the doctor growled, coming to a halt a few feet from him and Abercrombie. The tubbier man looked shocked and worried. "But it was a smart move to hold off using that air rifle of yours. As it is, you're a sight too free with it for my liking." "I had no option," Ross protested. "There are always options," the doctor snapped. "But what I want right now are some explanations. You've played the man of mystery long enough." "Doctor!" exclaimed Doyle, gasping to catch his breath after their sprint. "Can't this wait until later? Miss Smith could be in grave danger inside there." "Nothing that a few moments now will affect," the doctor answered. "And Colonel Ross's information may aid us considerably once we penetrate that lair." He turned back to the man again. "What have you been hiding? Apart from that scoundrel Breckinridge, who did you expect to find in there tonight?" Ross hesitated, his face troubled. Finally, he seemed to realize that he had no way out of this situation other than to provide the doctor with what he wished to know. With a deep sigh, he admitted, "My brother." A putrid stench in her nostrils shocked Sarah back to awareness. Gagging, she struggled to move her hands to cover her mouth, but was not able. As she coughed and choked, her mind started to focus once again. As she began to become aware of her surroundings, she wished she was still unconscious. "Take it away," she gasped, and the offensive odour was finally capped. "Back in the land of the living, are we?" asked a cheery voice. "At least for the time being, that is." Sarah struggled to free both her mind and body, but only the former worked. Her vision sharpened, and she could make out only too clearly where she was. It had to be some kind of laboratory hewn out of base rock, presumably deep underground, since there were signs of moisture on the wall and a constant dripping noise in the background. The air had that stale taste of caves or of old musty books. The room was roughly 20 feet across in both directions and about 10 high, but it was unfinished, and none of the walls were terribly smooth. The floor, as a contrast, was almost polished to a shine. Though electric lights were scattered about the chamber at irregular intervals, the place was still dark and creepy. That was without including the other trappings that made it even creepier. She managed to straighten herself up, finding there was floor beneath her unsteady feet. Her hands were manacled together above her head, above a pipeline that had supported her while she was out. The circulation in her hands was barely adequate, but she doubted that an appeal for freedom would cut any ice around here. The pipe she was chained over was one of about a dozen leading from the uncertain realms behind her into this room. Most of them led into a series of large glass tanks, but 3 of them led into a huge glass cylinder that stood in splendid isolation opposite her. The lights seemed to be concentrated about this tank, which was about 5 feet across and stretched almost to the ceiling. A thick, bluish liquid filled the column almost to the top. Bubbles gently stirred in the liquid. Inside the glass cylinder was a mermaid. Well, no, not exactly. It was male for one thing, that much was clear. A young boy by the look of him, with curly black hair and haunted eyes. There were what looked like gill slits in the side of his neck, which pulsed regularly, issuing some of the tiny streams of bubbles that rose within the column. The hands appeared webbed, the muscles of the shoulder abnormally strong. From the waist down, any resemblance to a human being ceased. The skin there was greyer, and the legs fused to make a longer body that ended in a tail that gently thrashed from side to side, enabling the mere person to maintain a constant position in the tube. Sarah was enthralled and sickened by the sight. When she could drag her eyes away from the creature, she swept them quickly over the rest of the room. Stacked along one wall were open vats of chemicals. In the centre of the room was a large pit. Within the pit, and rising to about 4 feet above the hole, was a large metal vat. Within it was some kind of gurgling, bubbling mess. It had the appearance of hand cream, but one that was pallid and unsettled, moving and venting constantly. There were about a dozen tanks in the room that contained various forms of aquatic life. Sarah recognised a baby seal mewling in one tank. Another contained a dolphin that looked rather the worse for wear. Several others gave off the pungent aroma of formaldehyde and contained various organs and portions of internal anatomy. There was one person in the room with her, regarding her with a mixture of amusement and interest. He was a tall, slightly chubby man with dark hair untidily brushed. He had piercing blue eyes and an almost cherubic face. "I'd ask you to explain that comment," Sarah finally answered him, her voice thick and still speckled with pain. "But I doubt I'd like the explanation." "Probably not," the man agreed readily. "Dear me, Miss Smith, your inquisitive nature has really caused you trouble this time, hasn't it?" "Oh, I'd say it was about par for the course," she replied. The strength was returning to her tired muscles now. If she could just keep this man talking long... What? Maybe she could break the handcuffs with a mighty tug? Fat chance. She wondered what the time was, and whether Alice had managed to convince her father of the need for action. If she stalled long enough, maybe help could arrive. Besides that, there was always the doctor. Sarah doubted he'd be too far away once the action began. But would he be close enough to do her any good? Speaking of which, Just what is the course?" Her captor gave her another of his happily innocent smiles. "Miss Smith, you have a terrible habit of wanting answers to questions you shouldn't even be thinking about in the first place. Haven't you ever heard the old saying about a little knowledge being dangerous to your health?" Sarah grunted. "If a little knowledge is dangerous," she quoted, "where is the man who has so much as to be out of danger?" She gave him a thin smile. Thomas Henry Huxley. "Oh, very good," the man approved. "You have quite a wit about you." He shrugged. "Of course, it is about all you do have about you. And speaking of danger, you are in it, and I am not. I suppose that makes me the man that you refer to." "And what makes you think I am in danger and you aren't?" asked Sarah, putting on the most innocent expression she could muster. She didn't really expect it to fool him for a second, so she wasn't too disappointed when he laughed at her. "Oh, you really are something special." He shook his head sadly. "Miss Smith. May I call you Sarah? Miss Smith sounds so formal." "Oh, by all means, let's dispense with formality," Sarah answered. "I'm not one to stand on etiquette. A stepladder maybe, but not etiquette. And what do I call you that's polite in mixed company?" "My name is Ross, Sarah." "Ross?" She narrowed her eyes and peered hard at him. "You wouldn't happen to be related to a Colonel Edmund Ross, would you?" "He is my brother." "Ah." Some of this was starting to make a strange kind of sense to her now. "And what do your friends call you? Assuming you have any, that is." "All men have friends, Sarah. Mr. Breckenridge, for example, is a very good friend of mine. I allow him to call me Percival." He smiled at her. "I imagine I could extend that courtesy to you, too, while you are still with us." "Charmed," Sarah replied. "I'd shake hands, but it's a trifle difficult right at the moment." She studied her captor with interest. This was definitely a man whose elevator didn't go all the way to the top floor. "Percival, what are you up to here?" My, he chided. "Curiosity killed the cat, Sarah, and I'm afraid it's going to kill you, too." "Can we drop the corny literary allusions?" Sarah begged him. "If you intend to kill me, where's the harm in telling me what I've got to die for?" Ross shrugged. "Why not? Immediately, you have to die because I sent those two blockheads after a dead body and they brought me back two live ones instead." "Well, that was something. Kipling's still with us, I take it?" Sarah asked. "For the time being, yes." Ross gestured to the large cylinder at the end of the room. "As soon as that chamber has been vacated, he'll probably end up in there. I'm not entirely certain that the process will work on someone who has so evidently past the point of puberty as Master Kipling. But if it kills him, then it saves me the bother of having to see to the task personally. And if it doesn't kill him, we'll have another worker." He patted her gently on the arm. "You, my dear, are obviously considerably past the age of puberty yourself. The process would definitely kill you, which is, I'm sad to report, your fate anyway. But it would also damage your internal organs, which would be a terrible waste." Sarah's mouth was definitely on the desert side of dry right now. "Yes," she agreed, trying to sound flippant. "I'd hate to see my organs go to waste. You know what they say about a mind being a terrible thing to waste." Ross laughed, genuinely amused. "Oh, you are a one, Sarah. It's a shame that you'll be staying with me, albeit in a number of small containers. I really would have liked the chance to spar with you a little more." "Well, you can't have everything," Sarah managed to joke. "You may have my body, but you'll never have my mind. Unless you intended to pickle that too." She was trying very hard to avoid thinking about his promises. "But aside from the fascination of taking my liver out on a date, why do you want my body parts so badly, Percival?" "For my work, Sarah," Ross explained. He gestured towards the cylinder and the mare boy within. "As you can see, I've managed to create my own rather unique life forms. I believe you came face to face with a number of my creations over the past few days. Yes, she shuddered. Mutant hounds, killer seals, and a rather pretty young mermaid. The tip of the iceberg, he assured her. Here in this laboratory, I have the means to achieve fusion of different animal species, combining their traits to form prototypical creatures that before now existed only in the imagination. Thanks to me, mermaids do exist. Sarah shook her head. I can't quite bring myself to believe this is just a hobby for you, she said. I mean, most people just take up collecting butterflies or stamps for a pastime. Are you just doing all this because you can? Ross looked shocked. Sarah, he chided, how petty you must think I am. Though I must admit that part of this is merely the desire to see what limits I can break. But my experiments do have a noble end. I am creating a separate species of human beings that will take mankind beyond the oldest boundaries imposed on our species. My merfolk are the first, if we don't include that dreadful hound boy which was unplanned. But I hope to create more very shortly. He waved his hands in the air like a comic opera sorcerer. Imagine crossing human beings with cheetahs, for example, and creating a race with the endurance and cunning and prowess of the major cats. What warriors and athletes they might become! Or taking a simple bat and making from it winged beings that could ride the air currents and really fly. Isn't that a project worthy of great imagination? It's certainly great something, agreed Sarah. BS, mostly. You can't be serious. He glared at her, his good humour vanishing in an instant. How can you say that after what you've witnessed? He asked. My powers are quite real. The merfolk are alive, their bodies stable, and they are viable. Do you understand what that means? Yes, agreed Sarah, impressed despite herself. That they can have children when they mature, and that they will breed true. Precisely. They can breed true. If I were to step aside now, the merfolk will continue to live and grow. I have done what no man has ever done before. I've created a new breed, a new genus as my legacy. I have achieved what nobody has even dreamed of before, least of all that obnoxious, overbearing older brother of mine. I suppose it's partly my fault from the beginning, Colonel Ross admitted. Everything Percival has ever done in his miserable life was an attempt to either prove that he was better than me, or else to try and hurt me for being what I am. And what are you? Asked the doctor carefully. If you're merely a military man, I'm a humbug. You remind me a little of a brigadier chappie I know. Ross sighed. I've been attempting to avoid answering that question since I arrived here, Doctor. But in the interests that seem to have linked us, I have little choice left to me now, do I? None at all, the doctor replied cheerfully. If I don't like or don't believe your replies, Doyle and I will truss the two of you up here, and mark you, do not open till Christmas. Doyle privately wasn't sure that the doctor's threat could be carried out quite that simply, but it appeared that Ross had already made his decision anyway. I am a special agent working directly under the command and authority of Her Majesty Queen Victoria, he answered. It is my job to investigate those matters that lie outside of the conventional. Since the reports were first received about a monster hound on the loose on the moors down here, I've been working to track down the guilty parties. Doyle's eyes went wide. You can prove that claim, I take it? Don't be an idiot, man, replied Ross, his voice edged with weariness. In this line of work, how long do you think I'd last if I carried papers that proved I was under explicit orders of the Queen herself? Quite frequently, I have to operate outside of both the law and this country. He nodded at the doctor. I think your friend knows I'm telling the truth. I'm inclined to believe most of what you say, the doctor agreed. As I say, you have the same manner as the Brigadier about you. Brigadier? Asked Doyle out of his depth. What Brigadier? I'll explain later, replied the doctor. To Ross he added, but I don't believe that shooting the hound was under explicit orders from anyone. There was no need to kill the poor creature." Ross shook his head. "Doctor, you do not seem to understand what my brother is capable of. I am attempting to eradicate every last foul deed he has perpetrated." "Are you indeed?" asked the doctor coldly. "Well, let me give you fair warning, Colonel. If you attempt to eradicate a single one of those mer-people he has somehow managed to create, I shall take great delight in feeding you to his seals, piece by bloody piece. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" "Indubitably." "Good. I'm so glad we understand one another." The doctor abruptly smiled. "Aside from those misguided attempts to cover your brother's tracks, you seem to be a reasonably decent sort of chappie." "Well, I'm still considerably in the dark here," Doyle protested. "What has looking for your brother and his manufactured monstrosities got to do with staying at Fulbright Hall? The whole family seems convinced you are planning to loot the blasted place." Ross shrugged. "A misunderstanding. Alice overheard me giving instructions to Abercrombie and managed to misinterpret them. True, Abercrombie is a thief and a scoundrel, but in this line of work it would be difficult to find a better partner." "Thanks a lot," muttered Abercrombie. "Talk about being damned with faint praise." "But what were you doing at the Hall?" persisted Doyle. "I first latched onto these experiments of my brother's in London," Ross explained. "There he had set up an inhuman laboratory to experiment upon living creatures. He's long been fascinated with the concept of improving on the works of nature. He read Darwin's On the Origin of Species while in college and decided that natural selection was an inefficient means of advancing change." "So he's elected to try unnatural selection," muttered the doctor. "Precisely." "But how does he achieve this?" mused the doctor. "Technology on the Earth in this time period is certainly not up to anything on the order of change that he's managed. What is he doing?" "I really have no idea how he works the technique," admitted Ross with a shrug. "Science is a background study for me. I know enough to get by on my missions, but little more. Percival is, in fact, the genius where that is concerned." "Genius my foot," snapped the doctor. "What he's doing is beyond impossible." He sighed. "I suppose I shall have to ask him his laboratory methods myself." "What else?" "Well, his experiments cost a great deal of money," explained Ross, "and he was financing some from the proceeds of the production of extremely fine replications of the official currency." "Printed his own," Abercrombie put in helpfully. "Damn good query it was, too." "Quite," agreed Ross dryly. "Well, we destroyed his presses, but by the time I was certain that was done, he had fled. I had seen his first experiment, that poor unfortunate hound, and when the reports of a gigantic beast on the loose reached me, I knew it had to mean that Percival had begun work again in this vicinity. The problem was deciding where. Since he needed a good deal of cash for his work, and there was no chance he could be printing it this soon, I knew he must have found someone to back his schemes. The only two people in this area with sufficient wealth were either Sir Edward Fulbright or Breckinridge." "Ah!" Doyle exclaimed with satisfaction. "And you chose to investigate Sir Edward first." "Precisely. A foolish error, which has caused a good deal of trouble and inconvenience for me." "But why him?" asked Doyle. "Surely Breckinridge was the most likely suspect." "Yes," admitted Ross, "and to my mind that made him less likely. You see, Percival employed a pair of assistants in London named Raintree and Brogan. Both men are currently employed as security officials at Breckinridge's factory. I reasoned that Percival planted them there as bait to lure me from the correct scent, since it was otherwise ludicrously obvious where he was." The doctor couldn't restrain his laughter any longer. "Oh, wonderful," he said between gasps. "Your devious little mind overlooked the obvious because it was obvious. I'll bet your brother is still chuckling about that still." He probably is, agreed Ross shamefacedly. There was another reason also. I could gain simple entry to Fulbright Hall because my old college chum, Roger Bridewell, had become engaged to Sir Edward's only daughter. I told him enough of my suspicions to make him willing to do anything to clear the suspicions against his future in-laws, so he managed to get me invited to the hall. I'll admit that I was not the most popular guest they'd ever entertained, but I did manage to confirm that Sir Edward was innocent of involvement. That left only Breckinridge. And so you elected to break in here tonight to check on your suspicions, the doctor finished for him. Yes. I realised that you were going to come here eventually. I had to beat you to the mark, I knew, but you seem to have anticipated my moves. The doctor grinned. Sheer dumb luck, if that's any consolation, he admitted cheerfully. I'd planned to be here later, but Sarah has managed to force my hand. Sarah? Ross frowned. What has she done? Managed to get herself captured by your brother, at a guess, the doctor answered. Ross went white. Then we had better end this conversation and get inside fast, he said. My brother needs 3 things for his experiments. Young children, who become the victims of his changes, animals from which he makes the extracts to effect those changes, and third, he needs fresh corpses from which he extracts human elements. These he uses on living animals, giving them humanoid speed and wits. I fear that Sarah is about to become the late Miss Smith, and that shortly afterwards various portions of her will find their way into various other species of creatures.